Good evening, everyone, and namaste. As we gather this evening, we once again call to mind with humility and also gratitude that we are on the territory of the Onondaga Nation. And certainly a very warm welcome to everyone on behalf of Call to Action, and certainly here at All Saints, we welcome everyone to be here with us tonight. And our reflection is Catholic culture wars. And, you know, some people think, well, gee, you know, the national cultural wars really isn't seeping into the church. But I saw an online NCR article, and I mentioned it at the parish this weekend. The Congresswoman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Well, she did an interview with Church Militant and said that the Catholic Church in the United States has been overcome by Satan. And then she did a separate interview with saying that the American bishops are ruining the United States of America because of their policies concerning immigrants and refugees. And not long before that, she was a special guest on WET, whatever that is, and was congratulated for her wonderful pro-Christian stance. So that reminds us, I think, there's a real cultural war going on even within our church. And yet, there's a way out, I think, and that's what we're all about tonight. So a very, very warm welcome. I just want to mention there's bathrooms in the back here, also some water and cookies, and just a couple of paid announcements here since I'm here. What can you do? Sister Betty Druso from Upstate Call to Action, a group of us went to the border in Texas in the Rio Grande a few years ago and made some very meaningful connections. And from that, we have a little grassroots program of raising funds here that we send down to real grassroots programs in the Rio Grande, like school, sidewalk school is an example. So Sister put together a beautiful card with a picture, and if anyone wanted to make a donation for the card, they're in the back, and Sister Maureen will be overseeing that. And then just coming up here on May 17th, our Caring for Our Common Home Task Force has invited us to reflect a little bit on working for environmental justice by using the money that we don't give away. How can we invest our money in ways that is supporting the environment and in supporting other justice issues? So there's a flyer in the back about that. So at this time, I'm very happy to welcome Sister Pat Bergen, who will lead us in prayer.
During these troubled times, we call upon our loving God and ask her to bless all our leaders who are making hard decisions for the betterment of our world. And as we gather tonight, we ask the Spirit of God to keep our minds and hearts open to what is being shared with us. So remember that the Spirit is loose and she is wild. Amen.
Pat's wild too, right, Pat? We're very blessed, I think, in our Syracuse, Central New York area to have a local chapter of the Upstate Call to Action. And we're very happy that our Dale Evers has agreed to sort of coordinate and pull us together, and that's what happened why we're here as part of the Thruway tour tonight. So, Dale.
Good evening. Thank you, Father Fred. So welcome. We're so excited. We've been planning this since October, I believe, and Michael has kind of feels like a hot potato because he's going to get handed off to each city and relay drivers and all of that. So he may not know where he is on Friday when he's all finished. We'll try and orient him. But we're so happy to see all of you here. I will make a little note that call to action-usa.org, I believe, is sponsoring Michael on a Zoom on May 18th at 8 o'clock. So if you haven't gotten enough tonight or want to invite other people, that's a really good opportunity to hear him from the comfort of your own living room. So I do want to share that. As well, there's a free will offering in the back. There's a basket back there, and that helps to pay for the expenses, et cetera, that we incur from this freeway tour, so we appreciate your generosity on that. I want to just say a couple of words about Call to Action. Call to Action was founded probably 50 years ago at the kind of the real crux of the church reform movement, and it is made up of progressive, committed Catholics throughout the United States. It has changed over the years, but its mission is still about church reform and social justice issues. We have a local chapter here, as Father Fred mentioned. Our next meeting, coincidentally, is May 14th at 10 a.m. We meet in a hybrid situation, so it's either Zoom and you can meet in person. And basically, it's a support group to help us stay optimistic about our church, but also to support each other's works in social justice movements. So it's really a wonderful, vibrant way of staying connected and hopeful about where we are in our world right now. So I highly encourage you to do that. If you're interested, there's sign-up sheets in the back. All I need is your email address. You'll get on our email list forever then, and I promise I don't send very many emails, but at least you'll be informed of our meetings that happen every 2 months or so. Okay? Thank you. All right, so now for the main event. Michael Sean Winters is a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter. Winters is also a senior fellow at the Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life at Trinity College. He is the author of God's Right Hand, How Jerry Falwell Made God a Republican and Baptized the American Right, which was published in 2012. And he's also authored Left at the Altar, How Democrats Lost the Catholics and How Catholics Can Save the Democrats in 2008. Winters is the U.S. correspondent for the International Catholic Weekly, The Tablet, based in London, and is a frequent commentator on issues related to Catholicism at NPR, PBS, and other media outlets. His essays have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Republic, Slate, and other publications. But his real claim to fame is that he is the proud papa of a beautiful St. Bernard puppy, little girl, okay? With that, Michael, we're so happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This is great to see such a crowd and to be in Syracuse, which I think I was in once before, and I can't remember what it was for, but I've been treated with incredible hospitality, both in Albany yesterday and today in Syracuse. So we're going to talk about the culture wars, and specifically how they have distorted Catholic teaching, and also in some ways how they've distorted what it means to be a liberal, and how we can combat them. And by combat them, I don't mean like get involved in the culture wars and win them, but how we can train ourselves to not take the bait. How do you not get dragged into it? And the hard part there is obviously there's a lot of money and very slick advertisers and marketers whose jobs are vested in keeping the culture wars going. And so it's a challenge, but they have begun to infect our church in really profound ways. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of that, and then move on to, I think, what drives the culture wars. And then the second half will be what can we do to kind of get out of it. So the most recent, I think, acute example of this was the anti-vaxxers who didn't want to get the vaccine because it had been developed with stem cells derived from an abortion that had been conducted in 1972 or something. And, you know, we Catholics have a very rich theology called the cooperation with evil, because in a complex society, The choices that are available to any one of us are dependent on choices other people have made, and some of those choices are bad. And we all pay taxes. Some of those taxes are going to go to the Pentagon, and some of that money is going to go to nuclear weapons, even though our church has said that nuclear weapons are unjust and immoral. But in a complex society, you have to make those decisions. And so we have this wonderful theology. And the Vatican and our bishops' conference could not have been more clear that in the case of the vaccine, it was perfectly morally licit to take the vaccine. But you had people saying, no, as a Catholic, I can't in good conscience take that. And no one has a conscientious right to ignore the common good. And it turned into a kind of libertarian argument, right? The don't tread on me. I don't know if you have them up here where I am in rural Connecticut. We have the Gadsden flags with the snake, the yellow flags. Don't tread on me. And I'm like, nobody wants to tread on you. I don't even want to touch you, crazy right-wingers. And my favorite part of that whole debate about the anti-vaxxers was when someone on Fox News one day said, look, it's my body, it's my choice. And I'm like, I've heard that before. I wonder where. Another example, religious liberty. Obviously, as Americans, this is one of our great contributions to Western civilization. We were the first country to say there should be religious liberty. Now, it's true that Vatican II, in the decree Dignitatis Humanae, did not actually endorse religious liberty as understood by our founding fathers, right? The classic liberal position is freedom is a freedom from government coercion. And that's not what Vatican II taught. Vatican II said freedom has to be oriented to the truth. It's rooted in the desire of the human heart to find and embrace truth. And when we started having the fight during the Affordable Care Act over the contraception mandate, many of our bishops adopted not the Catholic position, but the more Madisonian, you can't tell me what to do. And it became, you can't force our institutions. You can't, again, this kind of libertarian argument. Religious liberty in Catholic theology has to be oriented toward the common good. Everything in political life is oriented to the common good. So when you say you can't tell me what to do, well, that's not how, the better framing is, what in a complex society, in a diverse society, what do I owe people who I disagree with? What kind of respect, what kind of regard for their choices do I owe someone I disagree with? And that was lost, and both the Bishops' Conference and the Knights of Columbus completely abandoned what I would consider our Catholic teaching on behalf of this kind of libertarian understanding of it. I remember, and yesterday in Albany, there was a woman whose son was an organist at the cathedral in Baltimore, so she knew Archbishop Laurie. And I told her, I remember when the day Archbishop Laurie was installed as the Archbishop of Baltimore, a friend of mine who works in Rome, a priest, went up for the Mass and came back. We were having dinner, and he was horrified. And I had watched it on television, and I said, yes, he did not preach Jesus Christ and him crucified. He preached James Madison and him justified. It was obscene. So, again, now I also want to quick say one thing on behalf of your Metropolitan, Tim Dolan. I disagree with Cardinal Dolan about a lot of things, but the President Obama, who I admired and respect, put Dolan in a horrible bind. And as a reporter, I watched that unfold. The week before the November meeting of the bishops in 2011, Cardinal Dolan met with President Obama in the Oval Office, and he said, we're going to take care of this religious exemption on the contraception mandate. The next week in Baltimore, in the executive session, all the real crazy right-wingers in the bishops said, you can't trust Obama. And Dolan stood his ground and said, look, the President of the United States looked me in the eye and promised he'd take care of this. And 2 months later, Obama called Dolan and said, I couldn't make it happen. At that point, hey, you saw somebody, if somebody's out on a limb and you saw it off, not a good place to start. So I don't want to completely put all the blame on the bishops for that. Third issue, LGBT employment issues in the church. So this came up at NCR, and we were debating, should, under U.S. law, should a person who gets fired from a church ministry because they're gay or lesbian, should they be able to sue the church to get their job back? And there's a famous case. It didn't involve Catholics, it involved the Lutherans, and it didn't involve Catholic, LGBT issues. It involved the Americans with Disabilities Act. But it was called Hosanna Tabor, was the name of the Lutheran ministry in Missouri. And they were sued because they had fired a woman who said she couldn't do the job because of a physical disability, and she sued. And the Supreme Court ruled 8-0. The Supreme Court can't agree whether it's Monday, right? And they ruled 8-0 in favor of the church. Why? Because they said the last thing we want is the government deciding who can and cannot be a minister in a church. So we're not saying that there's not going to be injustices. We're saying once you're in church employment, you guys got to figure that out. We don't want the government involved in that. And I remember a colleague was saying, well, I think in this case, and I said, so what you're saying is Bill Barr can decide who works in Catholic ministries to help immigrants, right? Well, no, I don't think that. Well, no, that is what you're saying. And again, so here the distortion, even though our hearts may be with somebody who may have been unjustly fired, there's ramifications when you try to change the law, and the culture wars try to overcome that and ignore that and work on our emotions. And we've got to have the kind of mental maturity and intellectual maturity to step back and say, may not be fair, but you know what? The remedy is worse. You know, we've got to think things through. I was very pleased to see, Utah, the Church of Latter-day Saints, not a bastion of liberalism, got together with the gay rights activists in Utah, and they passed a religious liberty anti-discrimination law for LGBT community that both sides agreed on. And when that same proposal was brought to Washington, both the U.S. Bishops' Conference and the gay rights group said, we don't want any part of that. They don't want the compromise. They want the culture war. They want to win. They don't want to. And I just say, let's respect and admire what our Mormon brothers did. Or think of Bill Levada. Bill Levada went on to be the cardinal in Rome for CDF, but when he was the Archbishop of San Francisco, this was the 90s. It was before gay marriage had even been talked about. And the San Francisco City Council, obviously at San Francisco, they passed a law that said if you contract with the city government, you have to give benefits to same-sex partners. And he said, Rome's not going to let us do this. How about this? And he said, look, the San Francisco Catholic community has a lot of immigrants. How about those benefits can go to anyone who is legally domiciled with you? Because he said, I may have someone in the immigrant community, and it's an unemployed cousin who's living on the sofa who could use those benefits. And that was the compromise that they worked out. What's the downside? Everybody got the benefits, but we've lost that desire to find a reasonable compromise that people who disagree can live with, and I think we've got to try to find that again. I think the solution, actually, on LGBT issues is to be found in canon law. And in the late 70s, early 80s, when they were revising canon law, Adam Maida, who was then a priest working in Rome, later became the Archbishop of Detroit, he devised, I think it was something like 17 or 23 canons of administrative law. If you want to fire somebody, you have to go through these. These are the employees' rights. And a friend saw him one day in 83, 84, and in St. Peter's Square, and he was walking across the square crying, and he had just found out John Paul had said, we're not going to include any of that in there. And I think it was the bishops did not want anybody putting restrictions on their ability to hire and fire as they wanted. That's the solution, not to turn to the government, but to get our own legal system in place. And then the mother of all culture war issues, of course, is abortion. And I remember during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, you could turn it into MSNBC, and if they were talking about abortion, you'd have somebody saying, we're going to keep government out of the emergency room, out of the examining room. And then you'd switch to Fox News, and if they were talking about the ACA in general, not about abortion, they would say, we've got to keep the government out of the examining room. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, it's the same argument, and this is, again, anytime you smell that libertarianism, that's not going to be a Catholic argument. Catholics never can ignore the common good. There is no, I want it this way. That's not, self-will is not a Catholic virtue. And I think the pro-life groups obviously have allied themselves with a Republican Party that has shown indifference not only to other important Catholic issues, like immigration, but to other important life issues. How do you oppose abortion and not oppose the death penalty? And reverse. How do you oppose the death penalty and not oppose abortion? How do you not, at this point, climate change? If you don't see climate change as a life issue, you are engaged in obscurantism of a medieval quality. Actually, that's a slur against the Middle Ages. It's worse. Okay? The evidence is in. If you're indifferent to climate change, you cannot claim yourself to be pro-life. And then we had, in the debate over faithful citizenship, the bishop's document on voting last time, the idea to make it preeminent. They declared abortion was the preeminent issue. The name of that document is Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. And when the bishops decided this is the most important issue, what did they do? They are no longer forming consciences, they are replacing consciences. And that is not what the teachers of our church, and I've got a pretty good authority, because that line, the job of the church is to form consciences, not to replace them, is from Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia, I think 143. Pro-choice groups also engage in the culture wars, and sometimes are even worse. They refuse to actually confront the reality of abortion. And abortion, especially late-term abortions, are violent deeds. The first issue of Commonweal after Roe v. Wade in 1973, Daniel Callahan wrote, "I am willing, no, well prepared, to grant women that right to an abortion under law. I only ask that the society that grants this right be prepared to look with unblinking eyes at just what it is doing, not deceiving itself for one moment about even one aspect of what a granting of that right does. The values are being reconstructed by making the value of a potential human being dependent upon being wanted by its mother." And again, Catholics, the value of a human being is inherent. We can't take the dignity away from a human being, no matter how little they are. There's also, in the pro-choice movement, I think, a real unwillingness to confront both the historic and contemporary role of eugenics in the movement. So in 1919, Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, started a journal called the Birth Control Review. It's some pretty scary reading. And this was when the eugenics movement, which was at that time a real, and in some ways still is an Achilles heel for liberals, was in full flower. And she wrote, and I quote, that she feared, quote, "the rapid increase of the feeble-minded, of criminal types, of the pathetic victims of toil in the child labor factories," close quote. Well, why not just support laws that get rid of child labor? You know, this was scary stuff. And the next decade, Oliver Wendell Holmes, otherwise a great champion of liberal values and Supreme Court justice, wrote the decision in Buck v. Bell, in which the Supreme Court said the Commonwealth of Virginia could sterilize a mentally handicapped woman against her will. And the famous line in that Supreme Court decision was, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough." That's not how Catholics think. Now, this was eugenics before Joseph Mengele gave it a bad name, but you know, most third-term abortions are eugenic. It's because they find out there's a fetal abnormality. There are some for the life of a mother, and let's full stop. If the issue is the life of the mother, any legislation must always have an exemption to protect the life of the mother, full stop. But for eugenic purposes, that's really problematic. And on the international level, I don't think so much in America. One of the number one reasons abortions are procured is sex selection. And call me old-fashioned, I don't think it's okay to abort a child because it's a girl. And I don't know how feminism can endorse that, any version of feminism. So that's the kind of, that eugenic sensibility is there in the pro-choice movement, and they don't want to confront it. So those are the culture wars. And other countries have had them. Obviously, in France, it starts in 1789 and kind of continues up until, World War II. And it's the anti-church versus the church was a key part of it. In Italy in 1870, you get the anti-clericals versus the papacy. I love, though, Italians, only Italians. Anybody Italian here? Who's Italian? Italian-American? Okay. Italians are the only people who can be fiercely anti-clerical, and some of their best friends are priests. I love that about the Italians. It's just wonderful. It's like, yes, I'm on a diet, and I'll have another plate of pasta. It's great. In the United States, with a huge exception of the Civil War that I'm not going to discuss because it's a rabbit hole that would take us into various ways, most of our culture wars are a post-World War II phenomenon. And so you think about, and I think there's a couple prerequisites to that. First is the abandonment. The traditional role of liberalism in America was what? It was organized around economic issues. 1946, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. publishes The Age of Jackson. In the final chapter there, on patterns of American democracy, Schlesinger writes, and I quote, "American democracy has come to accept the struggle among competing groups for the control of the state as a positive virtue, indeed as the only foundation for liberty. The business community has been ordinarily the most powerful of these groups, and liberalism in America has been ordinarily the movement on the part of the other sections of society to restrain the power of the business community." That's old-style liberalism. But what happens to the Democratic Party in the post-war era? In 1948, the Democratic National Convention passes a civil rights plank, and the South walks out and forms the Dixiecrats and nominates Strom Thurmond for president. Quick story. So I used to run a restaurant. We were talking about that over dinner before I became a writer. For 17 years, I ran Kramer Books and Afterwards, this little bookstore cafe in Washington. And you may remember that when Strom Thurmond retired, Trent Lott was the Senate Majority Leader, Mississippi Senator, and he said the country would have been better off if Strom Thurmond had been president. And of course, he had to resign because this is an insane thing to say. And this is the only time I did something at our restaurant that made it onto Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the NPR game show, which was, we had a special drink that week, which was the Trent Latte, separate but equal parts of coffee and milk, which I just thought was brilliant. Anyway, so that's 48. 68, you have the Chicago Convention, and the Democratic Party falls apart over the issue of the Vietnam War. And at that point, you have the rise of the New Left. Everybody starts reading Howard Zinn. You know, there's a critique of America emerges. And Cardinal George, who's gone to God, he was the Archbishop of Chicago. I had many disagreements with Francis George, but he was brilliant. And his second doctoral dissertation was on enculturation and mission work. And he has this one sentence in his, or one paragraph in the introduction. He writes, "Americans, especially missionaries, who break out of this cultural conditioning and begin to see their native country through the eyes of a truly different people, sometimes turn American moralism on America itself. If the United States is not to be a beacon, the universally inclusive city on a hill, then it must be a sinkhole, the evil source of global exploitation. Sometimes this judgment is religiously justified as a prophetic stance. Sometimes in more sociological terms, disillusion calls itself countercultural. Criticisms of institutions and social structures is not, however, countercultural in an anti-authoritarian society such as that of the United States, where the mass media lionize dissent." That's me, mass media. "Nor is every social criticism prophetic. The Hebrew prophets, critical though they were, never told their people that they should renounce their past and cease to be Israelites. Rather, the prophets pointed to God and called their people back to their original covenant, to the best in themselves and their history. Modern alienation is not a biblical virtue." That's a really powerful indictment of a lot of post-war thought on the left. Then you have, obviously, in 73, Roe, and that, I think, consumes the creation of the culture wars. Interesting also, the Catholic Church's involvement on those three issues. The Catholic Church absolutely supported the fight for civil rights, was completely divided over the Vietnam War, and horrified by abortion. So the three issues affected the Catholic community quite differently. On the right, the emergence of the culture wars is, in my humble opinion, as a man of the left, even uglier and more dangerous, and is still so today. So you have this combination of the emergence of libertarian ideas about how the economy should be structured in combination with the Southern political strategy that becomes explicitly racist. So you have people like James Buchanan at the University of Virginia in the late 50s and Murray Rothbard. They go on to start the Cato Institute, funded by the Koch brothers and their money, and they start bringing these ideas together, kind of racist ideas with always anti-government, anti-big government, very influenced by Hayek and von Mises and the Chicago School of Economics. And has anyone in the room read Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean? Okay, homework for everybody. And Dale actually I sent her the bibliography, so if you're signed up on the call to action list, you're going to get all the books or articles I'm citing tonight. So, Democracy in Chains, Nancy McLean, great historian at University of North Carolina, really when she went into this building at George Mason, and all this correspondence was just like hanging around, and so she just started photocopying it and making copies and did this real deep dive. And she wrote, summing up the work of the Koch brothers and this guy Buchanan and Rothbard, the mission of the cadre was quite literally revolutionary, although a cause with so much money would not need violence. The ruling class to be overthrown consisted of the leaders of labor unions, those corporations and business associations that continued to seek special benefits through lobbying, and the intellectuals who supported government action. Buchanan supplied much of the analysis used by the team at Cato as they generated nonstop propaganda, and all of this held together by the gravy train opportunities Koch's money made available as they pushed their case into the media and public life. I did, when Pope Francis was coming in 2015, Cato had a panel discussion about him, and I was on that. And there was this guy from the business school at Catholic University, which is this real right-wing libertarian business school. I don't think a Catholic university should have a business school unless it's called the Dorothy Day School of Business, about the filthy, rotten system. But he goes on, and they're asking about, and he says, well, you know, Pope Francis, he's from Argentina, so he's been affected by crony capitalism, and, you know, that kind of colors his whole view. And I'm like, wait. I don't ever remember anybody saying, you know, Pope Benedict, he's from this snow globe Bavarian village. You're either the Pope or you're not. What is this? That they were so condescending to Francis. That was the Cato Institute. Then the other part of this, of the rise of the culture wars on the right, was the rise of racist populism. And there was a direct line from Strom Thurmond to George Wallace to Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump. I don't think there's any denying that. You can see it at the local level, at the polling level. You can see it in voting precincts, and not just in the South, right? And the other thing that made it possible was you had, in the last 40 years, this kind of consensus on neoliberal economics. Now, I told you I don't remember really being in Syracuse before, but driving around upstate New York and being from a part of Connecticut where the thread mills, the jobs left in the 60s. And the town where I go to church, the only growth industry is opioids. And, you know, there's a lot of alienated people. And the Clinton economic policies didn't have a lot for those people. The Obama economic policies bailed out the banks, but they didn't bail out Main Street. And so politically, the left has a lot to answer for and help in allowing people to get so alienated from their society and their political institutions that they looked at Donald Trump and saw him as an answer. I mean, that's scary. And Trump is not a magician. He was able to work on something that was there and say, I'll get you out to the polls again. I'll fix it. Remember, I alone can fix it. And people who are low information voters and have seen presidents of both parties not do much to help them get jobs back, they were vulnerable. I can't emphasize too much how much the culture wars are fueled by money and the constant need for fundraising. And if you've done fundraising, you know the more fraught the appeal, the more likely people are to write checks. And so they have that interest in going for the emotional argument. So on an issue like abortion, you're going to get the thing that tugs at your heartstrings either way. And then you throw in the fact that campaigns become professionalized. So I worked on 2 campaigns in 2004, and the DCCC flies in these kids from God knows where who don't know anything about our district. And they're like, negative ads. We're going to tear this guy down and all this. And down the street was this guy, Stanley Israelite. I'm from the part of Connecticut where Chris Dodd, who was our longtime senator, came from. When he first ran for Congress in 1974, Stan was his campaign manager. Stan had been the head of the Chamber of Commerce. And in 1974, when you ran a campaign, you didn't demonize your opponent because you had to have a relationship with that guy the day after the election. But as soon as it's professionalized, these kids, I don't know where they were from. I don't know where they're going the day after the election. They don't care. So and that's partly on us. We respond to negative advertising. I mean, they do it for a reason. It works. And then you add in the power of social media where the algorithms reward angry people, not smart people. Not people looking for common ground. I saw the other day a tweet from Tony Annette. Tony Annette wrote a book. It's on my list, Cathonomics. If you don't read anything else this year, read Cathonomics, How Catholic Tradition Can Create a More Just Economy. And he wrote, fighting tedious culture wars while the planet burns is the truest form of decadence. Can I get an amen? Amen. And here's the last characteristic of the culture wars. They're not winnable exercises. They're not intended to be winnable. The people, if they were to win, lose their jobs. And you get this weird, the dirty secret about culture wars, like there's a symbiotic relationship between the pro-choice and the pro-life groups, and between the anti-gay and the pro-gay groups. They get it. They can use each other's messaging to raise money again. It's nutty. Last point. We have a culture. I organized a conference last month. 2 months ago, right? It's May, in Chicago. And the smartest thing, a bishop got up and he said, I don't know what we do with this, but I'm just going to put it out there. We have a culture of grievance, and we have a theology of grace and gratitude. How do we bridge that? And it's not that there are not good reasons for grievance in our society. Again, that alienated Trump voter who, hasn't had a good job prospect for 20 years has a legitimate grievance. African Americans have really legitimate reasons for grievance. But when you have a culture of grievance, how do you preach a theology of grace and gratitude in that? It's hard. You can't do evangelization until you do, though. The first task of evangelization has to be building culture. And we are now in our second generation where our universities, we were driving over here today, and I realized, university life is a big part of this town. But for 2 generations now, we've raised our intellectual elites, our lawyers and our thinkers and all that, on deconstructionism. They read Foucault and Derrida. And again, it's important to deconstruct culture, to understand that, there's power dynamics behind the narratives. But you need to learn how to construct it too, and we don't teach people that. It's a remarkable thing when you watch the hearings of now Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and you watched Ted Cruz, who's a loathsome human being, question her in ways that were so offensive. These two spent 3 years at the same law school, at the same institution, and came out with nothing to mutually respect each other? How is that possible? How is that possible? So I've been told to leave a lot of time for questions. So the next section I'm going to give you the real synopsis of, which a couple years ago for the first week of Lent, the Vatican goes on retreat for the first week of Lent, the Curia officials. So I treated my readers to a 5-day retreat. I had reread that winter H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ in Culture, where he talked about a taxonomy of 5 different approaches. Christ against culture, the Christian radicals, so obviously like the early Christians against paganism, but in our time, the Catholic worker movement. People who say, I respond to the lordship of Christ, not to the claims of culture. The accommodationists who do the opposite, Christ of culture, etc. And I have a whole thing on that I could share with you, but in the interest of time, you can find those 5 essays. I wrote about it. But do yourself a favor. If you like a really interesting book, it was published in 1950, and it's a Protestant book. And so he always highlights the differences, right? The either-or quality of the issues. We're Catholics. We have a much more humanistic, and we like to connect and combine. It's both and. A Protestant says grace or nature. We say, no, it's grace and nature, faith and reason. The here now and the hereafter. That's a tick of the Catholic intellectual imagination. So it's an interesting read, though, for a Catholic. But God, is it a good book? And the reason to read it, again, it's not to criticize the other guys, to learn how to criticize ourselves, to help train our minds not to get sucked into the culture wars. So that's the 35,000-foot level. Niebuhr did it. Great read. That's your assignment. But what can we do now at the 5,000-foot level? And I've got a couple of ideas, as individuals, as citizens, and as a church. And the first, I hate to say this, and 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have to say it. But at this point, we have to support democracy. Think of how sad that is. We have to not just go out and please make sure in your district, the people who are going to be counting ballots on election day are people that are trustworthy. And if not, run for that office, right? Become a poll watcher. We've learned everything now with our cameras. We can video everything. Make sure we are attending to how votes are counted. But it's also more than that. When I go to a college campus, inevitably, a kid, professor, several kids are going to say, I can't really talk freely about certain issues on campus. Democracy is a habit of mind. It's not just a ballot counting thing. So my town, I have has 1,700 people, and all legislative and executive authority is still vested in the town meeting. And that habit of coming together to get things together, it's much more possible to do at a local level. Now, it's harder. We started by talking about the anti-vaxxers. The young man who mows my lawn, who is just a great kid, and he wouldn't get the vaccine, and he was like, oh, no, it's going to make you a zombie. And I'm like, yeah, but you'd be such a cute zombie, And I listened to his reasons, and there was not going to be any moving him. And it took some stretching for me to say, I'm still going to I'm not going to have him inside my house until we're all vaccinated. This was before we had the vaccines. But I had him and his wife over for dinner when we could sit out in the summer outside at the picnic table. And we were socially distanced, and that was okay because he's a good kid. He just, he works with a bunch of guys who their ringleader went to Steubenville. And he, kind of sets the tone for the group, and you want to belong, and, pretty soon you're making really bad decisions. So support democracy at several levels, but make sure your kids are not afraid of debate. Make sure your kids are engaged debate and know how to make an argument, are not afraid, and know that you bring evidence to an argument. Passion is not enough. Anger, you don't get points for anger in a democracy, or you shouldn't. And the second part of that for us as Catholics, and especially as liberal Catholics, bring your faith into the public square. How did Jerry Falwell become the face of religion in America? In the 1960s, the face of religion was Dr. King, William Sloane Coffin, and the Berrigans. And then it became Jerry Falwell and his miserable children. How? Let's be out there and reclaim that. Second thing we can do, and this can be hard, allow our religious commitments to form and criticize our political commitments, not the other way around. We're Catholics first. We live in an anti-philosophic society. My friend Leon Wieseltier was at the Jewish Review of Books meeting before the pandemic. I have no sense of what time was before the pandemic, right? I think it was 2016. And he made this point. He said, he's Jewish, he used the example of Jews, but it works for Catholics. You can wake a Catholic up in the middle of the night and say, what do you think of Obamacare? What do you think of climate change? And they can tell you. But you say, what does it mean that God became incarnate in Jesus Christ? What? Let me go back to sleep. We have to, if we want to overcome polarization, the price of admission is the willingness to call out your side, not just the other side. And there is reasons to call out liberals. They can be foolish. Both sides can be. There was an article in Commonweal end of March, and someone said, it was about meritocracy and the criticism of meritocracy that people like Michael Sandel have engaged in. And he had this line, he said, meritocracy has created the most insufferable ruling class in human history, and he's right. And that's not just about conservatives. I lived in Washington 37 years, let me tell you. It's self-referential, and what we put politicians through, of course they lose their souls. They spend 5 days a week dialing for fundraising, asking people for $50 and $100. I mean, it's inhumane. But we have to, and the obvious issues for starting, if you're a Democrat, question them on abortion. It doesn't have to be total opposition, and this is all going to come back to the states come June. But say, in Europe, the cutoff is 12 to 14 months in most countries, except, again, for the life of the mother. Well, weeks, right. That would be some pregnancy, but and that's workable. Only in America did this fight over abortion continue the way the other countries were not torn apart by this. Even when Ireland, which for a variety of historical reasons had a complete ban on abortion, and then by referendum moved to, I think, a 12-week ban, they did the ban and they were done. That was it. That's not going to happen in America. But it's okay to challenge Democrats on things like third-term abortions. It's okay to challenge Republicans on climate change. I mean, those would be my top two issues, on both sides that I think both parties get wrong from a Catholic perspective. 3, and this is a personal thing, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but I got to tell you, can we stop with I'm going to speak in a prophetic voice. The prophets were reluctant, right? Isaiah chapter 6, when he starts describing how he became a prophet, says what? Woe is me. And he doesn't start prophesying until the seraphim takes the hot ember and burns his lips. Jeremy adds, need to be infrequent to be effective. And great book, if you've never read it, Prophecy Without Contempt by Kathleen Caveney, who teaches both law and theology at Boston College. One of the 5 smartest people I've ever met. Read everything Kathy Caveney writes. She's just brilliant. And so she wrote this book, I think it came out in 2015, 2016, and I reviewed it. And she this was one of the observations that I thought was so fascinating. For the Puritans, the breach of the covenant was their prevailing sins, which were more or less uncontroversial. They all agreed what counted as a sin. And the penalty was the loss of material prosperity. In our era, however, it seems that this structure is completely reversed. The uncontroversial covenantal obligation is to secure the nation's economic and military well-being. Political parties that do so are rewarded with the opportunity to implement their own contested version of what counts as virtue and vice. Now think how that dynamic plays out in terms of the culture wars. Politicians win on economic issues. Voters, any poll will tell you that's what they vote on, but then they get to appoint Supreme Court justices to reward either their lefty base or their right-wing base and impose all sorts of laws. But that's not what the voters were voting for. They were voting for a change. They wanted a different economic thing. But that's how that comes along. Again, that's how the culture wars keep getting fed. Also, and again on this point of the prophetic voice, not every battle has to be not every disagreement has to be a battle, and not every battle is civilizational. The other side doesn't have to be evil. They can just be wrong. God whispered to Elijah, and the hardest thing in America today is to be who one is quietly. And lastly, and this is the writer in me, it's become a cliche. The right wing says, I'm exercising a prophetic voice. The left says, I'm exercising a prophetic. Let God choose the prophets. Let's just say, I think, I believe, and here's my argument. 4th, inform your conscience, and especially what the church teaches about conscience. Again, the bishops got it wrong 3 years ago. We've got beautiful teaching on conscience, but most Americans, I think conscience is what? I think they think it's whim. You can't tell me what to do with my conscience. I don't even like the phrase my conscience because it misunderstands what conscience is. Conscience is not me talking to myself in the shower. It's God's voice. It's the devil here and the angel here saying, don't do that. Go ahead. Right? That's conscience. It's the divine law. John Henry Newman, you all know, who's now a saint, great writer, great thinker, great theologian. He said this in his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk. The rule and the measure of duty is not utility, nor expedience, nor the happiness of the greatest number, nor state convenience, nor fitness, order, and the pulchrum. Conscience is not a long-sighted selfishness, nor a desire to be consistent with oneself. But it is a messenger from him who, both in nature and in grace, speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules by his representatives. Conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas. And even though the eternal priesthood throughout the church could cease to be, sorry to the priests who are present, in conscience, the sacerdotal principle would remain and would have a sway. Close quote. If John Henry Newman had not written the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, or had not written the beautiful sermon Second Spring, or the beautiful poem The Dream of Gerontius, if he had just written that paragraph, he would still be one of the great thinkers and writers in the English language. Read the whole letter to the Duke of Norfolk. It's gorgeous. Conscience is also an application. So I was blessed, my pastor, when I was a teenager, when you start thinking, do I believe this stuff? When it starts becoming existential, was an unreconstructed 60s liberal. You know, he had gone to seminary in Paris with the Sulpicians, and he always used to say, you know, even before the council, he said, you know, the phrase they gave you were the laws of the church are the stars to guide you by. And that's not a stop sign. Americans have a trouble with that. We have a common law tradition, right? We think all four wheels have to come to, that's the law. But church law doesn't work that way. The church law, it's an applied thing. Whether we want it or not, we're in this post-Kantian world where our faith has become very propositional. It's yes or no. It's either or. It's not that kind of fundamental orientation and trust in God at every moment of your life. And that's what we have to reclaim. 5, just to throw this out there, especially because I hear you guys are doing a great job on your synodal processes. Dissent is different from conscience. If somebody says, well, in conscience I dissent, that's a misunderstanding of phrases. Conscience is where you say, there's the teaching, and here's how I apply it. And I may apply it in a way that the church would not endorse. Dissent is when you say, I think the teaching is wrong. Now, I try not to say the teaching is wrong, because I'm trying to help the church move along, and I find it's much better to say, in an area like, I think, it's teaching on homosexuality, it is manifestly inadequate. And, you know, I've been told that by people who work in the Vatican. It's manifestly inadequate. It is. They know it's a disaster. And I don't know that it's going to change anytime soon. But I also know church teaching isn't Plato or taffy. It stretches and it develops, but it doesn't stretch to endorse everything. And that prior to any particular ethical teachings, I think we Americans, we always reduce religion to ethics, and we have to resist that. We have to remember, you know, look at this altar. What we fundamentally believe in is what? Is the empty tomb. And that speaks to us about what it means to be a human person before we say this is what's right and that's what's wrong. There are beliefs we have as Catholics about the goodness of human nature and the corruptibility of human nature, but that the fundamental goodness of it that precedes any particular ethical teachings. Americans, we have a hard time with that. We usually leave our dogmas at the door. We think, oh, if you bring the dogmas into the public square, you're going to start the 30 years war again. No, you're not. That's a very Protestant thing that we've picked up. It's not healthy. Finally, develop a Catholic worldview. We Americans tend to be myopic. And we think the concerns that we have are the concerns of the world, okay? One of the great things about Pope Francis, and where I think he challenges Americans left, right, center, is what do we fight about? We fight about pelvic theology. We fight about sexual matters. And he said, this is about the poor. What are we doing for the poor? The marginalized. I have a friend, and she's a lesbian, and she always goes, I'm marginalized, and I'm like, yeah, and you got a master's degree from Yale. Got to tell you, marginalized, if you've been to a barrio or a favela, that's marginalized. You don't know where lunch is coming from. You may not have running water in the house. And those are the people, if Christ came to, he would, of course, go to the existential peripheries. And of course, he would find his way to some meetings of some LGBT Catholics. He does do that now, right? Christ finds his way. But Francis is saying, you in the rich North, there are some real pressing concerns in the global South we need you to pay attention to. So, myopia. And following on that, the first thing I think we have to do in forming a Catholic worldview is pay attention to the influx, especially of the gifts of our brothers and sisters from the Latino church. I have a good friend, he's a bishop from Puerto Rico, and he had back surgery last year, and I went down to visit him a couple times, and we were out one day, and he said, well, the church in Latin America is much less moralistic than the U.S. church. And I said, Bobby, you said that to me the first time we had dinner in 1990. And so my question is, if the Latino church is less moralistic than the U.S. church, it is instead more fill in the blank. And I've had that conversation with several Latino theologians and other bishops, and there's a bunch of things to add in there. It's more relational. It is more affective. It is much more sympathetic with, but also much more honest about the human condition. Okay? Progress is, the idea of progress that we have can be a distorting thing. It can also be a prod to move for social justice, but it can distort our view. And I want to do some conferences on that because I think it's important. But what I think we need to do, as I'm looking out of the room, and this is a largely Anglo audience, we have to very quickly, and the clergy, you got to do this right pronto, this generation. We've got to help the Latinos hold on to those gifts that they bring and not assimilate to a gringo church that has become an upper middle class club for people with, conservative sexual ethics. No, we've got to help them. We need their gifts. So how do we help them retain that relationality? How do we learn from that? So that's the first thing I think in forming a Catholic worldview. Second, make sure you develop a worldview, not an ideology. And that's hard. We need a worldview because you can't start fresh every day. We've learned things in life. We think we know what's true and what's false and what smells bad and what smells good. And so you create a worldview. But if it becomes reified, if it's not open to new information and new experiences, it becomes an ideology. And the Holy Father warns us against this again and again and again and again. I'd like to use the metaphor, and I'm thinking out loud here. It's an article I'm working on. It's still in my head. That, you put blinders on a horse so it can race, so it won't get distracted, so it's focused. But you don't bring the blinders out 3 feet, or the horse would not be able to keep it. It wouldn't work. And that's what ideology does. It's the 3-foot blinder. The worldview is this. You need it, but don't let it become excessive. Third, and I alluded to this earlier, both and. We're Catholics. It's an intellectual trick of our mind that we want to cultivate. Instead of saying, you can't do that, it's this, how do we synthesize? How do we connect? How do we combine? How do we build a bridge, not build a wall? D, that taxonomy that Niebuhr gave us, very, very helpful to keep us honest about ourselves. And let's face it, we all like to cherry pick our scripture verses. And if you avoid the difficult verses enough, you can forget they're even there. And that's dangerous. And lastly, and there's no substitute, and you have this in the example of your the synodal process. And it's St. Benedict's rule. It's ora et labora. You have to work and you have to pray. And the work is to learn more and more and more about 2 things, about this amazing moral and intellectual tradition that we have as Catholics. There is no issue in American public life that doesn't benefit from being seen through the lens of Catholic social teaching. It is this great gift. So many kids don't even know about it, okay? And then the other thing you have to do to keep your honesty is listen. Pope Francis, early on in Gaudium, Evangelii Gaudium, talked about the See, Judge, Act paradigm that came from Cardine in the 20s as a way of proceeding, that you see what's going on in the world, and then you judge it in the light of the gospel, and then you decide what's the appropriate action. The synod actually morphs the see to a listen. Because, I can see the back of the room from here, but I can't listen to what might be being whispered in the back. The listening, you've got to get close. And so he's now asking us to listen to each other. And it's not just listening to everybody in this room. You all know. If you belong to Call to Action, you know what you think. You probably know what your neighbor thinks. It's listening to the person who voted for Trump and finding out how that happened. And I'm going to say there are some people, God help them, there's no conversation there. I believe there's a lot who are just there because they've been looked down on. They've been made to feel stupid. They're confused. We have to learn to listen to each other as Americans and as Christians. And I think that is part of the labora. And then we have to just keep praying. We have to every day throw ourselves down on the mercy of God, and we always have to just keep telling ourselves the tomb was empty. And we have to believe it the way I believe this is a cell phone, right? No metaphors. There was a great moment, you can find it on video. One of my great mentors, and I'll finish with this, Lorenzo Albacete, was this 300-pound Puerto Rican Monsignor, and he was a slob. He always had ashes from a half pack of Marlboros and his breakfast. But he was brilliant and naughty. He was so naughty. He had been a nuclear physicist, and he always had to have the latest gimmicks. And I mentioned Archbishop Lori before, the Archbishop of Baltimore. When he was the auxiliary bishop of Washington, Lorenzo was a priest of Washington, and Lorenzo had gotten a car phone. It was the 80s. This was when only the President of the United States and mobsters had car phones, right? And Bill was scandalized by this, and he called Sean O'Malley, who was one of Lorenzo's good friends, and said, Friar Sean, this is awful that he has this. And so they're driving around Boston, and Sean is telling Lorenzo, Bishop Lori is very scandalized that you have a car phone. And, well, this was a red flag. Lorenzo says, oh, really? Okay. Picks up the car phone, calls Bishop Lori. Hello, Bishop Lori, this is Lorenzo. I'm driving around Boston with Bishop Sean. And, oh, Bishop Lori, can you wait a moment? My other car phone is ringing. Oh! Anyway, but where was I going with Lorenzo? Lorenzo, and I'll leave you with this. So Lorenzo said this to me once. We were talking about human sexuality, and he was my confessor for a time, so he heard some pretty wild things. I remember calling him after Mardi Gras and saying, Monsignor Albacete, my fear of overcommitment did not come up. And he said to me, Mike, when St. Augustine tells us that the conjugal act between a married couple open to the procreation of children, that even this is stained by the sin of concupiscence, he's really telling us something very liberating. And I thought about that, and I realized this is why Latinos and Italians don't get hung up on sex the way we gringos do, is we sin. We sin. There's concupiscence. There's self-will and all these things we do. We're human beings. That's why we have a Savior. It's okay. But we have to believe in the empty tomb. So anyway, Lorenzo was at Comunio Liberazione. It's a pretty conservative, I don't know if you have it up here. But it's an Italian group. He would always say it's like Opus Dei for lazy Catholics, and or bad Catholics, for bad Catholics. So he would always have Friar Sean down, and so they would do this little dialogue. And it was, must have been like 2015, because the Pope, 2014, because the Pope had brought, Sean is on that Council of Cardinals that advises the Pope. And he had brought them to Assisi for the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi. And I don't know if you remember, they stopped at a hospital with these severely physically handicapped kids, and the Pope was hugging them. And Sean recalled that the Pope had said, these children are the wounds in the body of Christ, are the wounds of Jesus Christ. And Lorenzo jumped in, he said, this is not a metaphor. They are the wounds of Christ. And if they are not, there has been a disincarnation. That, I think, is what Vatican II was all about. Recapturing the wonder of the claims at the heart of our faith. I realized this in the 1980s. I came out in 1981. And the 1980s, if you were a gay man in Washington, D.C., was about watching your friends die. And it was not a natural. When your grandparents die at a ripe old age, that's natural. These were kids in their 20s. It was completely awful. And so I learned pretty early on of necessity to realize that the body of a dead person you love is the question of our belief. Do you believe that that body is risen from the dead? And so when I walked into the church today and I saw the Paschal candle and the lilies and this is what it's got to be about. How did we let it become about the culture wars? So we owe it to ourselves to reclaim our faith and then bring that faith as best we can to the world because it needs it. So thank you, and I will take any questions.
Michael Sean is gracious enough to answer or address any of your questions. I have a mic so that everyone can hear you, because no matter how well you say you project, there are going to be people behind you that can't hear. So please indulge me. Who wants to ask the first one?
So is it working?
Yep.
Yes, okay. So, hello, and thank you for coming. Closer to my mouth.
Yeah, there you go.
Closer to my mouth. So I'm breathing all over this, and
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. So the thing that kind of is in my mind about what you're saying is this. I am really concerned about the culture wars. I've been writing about the culture wars on my little Facebook page for 5 years, if you can imagine. And I am afraid that if we ignore the culture wars, if we do not respond, then all of our Catholic friends are going to start doing the Bible in a year from Taylor Marshall,
Right.
who believes and tells people, well, I don't know what he believes, but what he tells people is that hell is, below our feet. That's what the Bible says. And so I just, I want to believe that what you're saying is right, that the way to move forward in faith is to ignore the culture wars, but I do feel them swirling around.
I wouldn't say ignore. I would say we just have to find a different way of being in the world as active Catholics. And I have found invariably that the listening part is key. That you have to ask people to, well, how do you think about this? How do you, and sometimes you get articulate, sometimes you get very inarticulate things, but people in America don't always feel heard. And so, and I think you do start, hey, I have to write an opinion column. Like, the Lord is so generous in his gifts, but he never asked for anyone's help on being judgmental, and my job is to be judgmental. So I'm not saying this is easy, but there's a way of being judgmental. So like one of the things I try to do is always remember I'm fighting against somebody's ideas, not against the person. And I think that's always important to remember that, somebody may have lousy ideas and also be a really wonderful grandparent or parent and or a good teacher, but maybe kooky on stuff. You never know what else, whatever other tragedies or hopes somebody has in their life. But we do know that we're called to accompany them in that. And so it's not so much ignore the culture wars as try to find a way to lower the temperature and be more faithful to the tradition. I'll give you an example. So one of the criticisms that you got of Pope Francis during the debates on what became Amoris Laetitia, the two synods on the family, was, he's watering down Catholic teaching about marriage. And the Pope confronted that really intelligently and said, there is no greater way to water down the faith than to forget that at its heart is mercy. That's watering down the gospel. And I find if you, rather than take the bait to fight about, divorced and remarried and blah, 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 but do what the Pope did and say, whoa, 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 whoa. How is focusing on mercy a watering down of this gospel? That changes the terrain in a way that actually can invite somebody in. There are some people that are not going to be invited. There are some bishops who are not going to, when I organized this conference and we were doing the list, I was like, there are some bishops that are just waiting for Francis to die. I have no interest in talking to them. Sorry. I mean, I wish them well, but there's no dialogue to be had. But I do think there's a fair number of Catholics, certainly, who are kind of conservative, and they don't understand the Pope, but they're not hostile to him. They just are a little confused. Americans have a long history of seeing ourselves as, a providential nation and baptizing capitalism and all that. And to unpack all that, it's not something that's done in a day. So I don't know if that helps, but it's not ignore them, but figuring out a different way to be present in the world as a public Catholic. Come on, I was told this was a rambunctious group. I'd like questions in Latin, please. Father? No?
Question.
Okay.
I was in seminary in one time in my life, and I took a course from Gustavo Gutierrez. And Gustavo used to say at the beginning of a lot of his lectures, you must begin with the poor. And we couldn't understand what he was saying. And so we would ask him, and he finally slow it down, he'd say, you must begin with the poor. How do people like us, we are not poor,
Right.
where do we begin? What do we do to make any sense of that kind of commandment?
It's a really good question. Did everyone hear that? Okay, so it's how do we start with the poor? And part of it is to not romanticize poverty. Like we can say, well, in some ways we're all poor. Yeah, that's okay. But you know what? I've had 2 good meals today, and I'm going to go after this, and I'm going to have a cocktail in a nice restaurant. I'm going to sleep in a warm bed. It's to make yourself around the people that don't have that. And it's not just writing checks, but to actually try to encounter them and to look at them and see Jesus. And that's not always easy. What did Mother Teresa say? Jesus in a distressing disguise. I remember I was lucky enough to be in the cathedral 20 years ago when Sean O'Malley was installed in Boston. And he told the story of a Cardinal Archbishop of New York, and someone comes into the chancery, a homeless guy who's off his meds, who says, I'm Jesus Christ. And the woman at the desk calls up and says, what do I do? There's a guy down here who says he's Jesus Christ. And the Cardinal says, look busy. And of course, everybody laughed in the cathedral. And then Sean paused and he said, but of course, that homeless man who's off his meds is Jesus Christ. Amen. And at that moment, Sean O'Malley really became the Archbishop of Boston and started turning that church around. And that church needed to be turned around in every way that a church can be turned around. And it's happened, and it's been slow. And Sean's pretty conservative, but he's totally with Francis. I'll tell you a quick story. So one day I asked Sean, I said, tell me what Elizabeth Warren, I'm a huge Warren fan. And I said, what's she like? And he goes, well, we've been at, public events together, but we've never broken bread. And I'm like, oh, no. She's now your senior senator. You give me some dates, and I've got a good friend who knows her, and we're going to get her to dinner. So it took a while, the bureaucracy of the church to get the dates. We called her office. They got back to us in 20 minutes and said, we'll be there for dinner on March 3rd or whatever it was. So I flew up for this, and went really well, about a 2-hour dinner. They really hit it off, and after I was staying at the residence there, and he, Sean has this deep basso voice, and he said, well, Michael, Sean, how do you think that went? And I said, Sean, I think you had her when she didn't know this about you. Sean's a pretty conservative guy. At this point, he's the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, right? I said, but you told her that in 1969, when you were a priest in Washington, Marion Barry asked you to co-chair a committee on domestic worker wages, and your co-chair was Gloria Steinem. She didn't know that about you, So why is Sean, who's a pretty conservative guy, been so enthusiastic about Pope Francis? Because Sean has always been with the poor. So whether he was in the Virgin Islands, whether he was in Fall River, and where he gets nervous is when he has to be around rich people, That's when Sean gets nervous. When he's happiest is when he's in his friar's schmata. He's always wearing that, brown sack. And he is completely indifferent. Like to cook. And I've never met somebody who's so completely indifferent to food. If you bring him for a fancy dinner, you're wasting your money. You can give him a tuna fish salad sandwich and he's completely happy. So that comes from sustained, repeated ministry to the poor. So there's no, to answer your question, you do it. There's just, you have to get involved and be with the poor. But it's also not an individual thing. It's what we as a country and as a wealthy church have to do to offer our resources to, really struggling communities and in Africa and Latin America and obviously in Ukraine now. And you do what you can. But there's no shortcut around that. There's no way to do that on the fly or on the cheap. You got to actually spend time and listen. And it's not always easy because poor people can behave badly. They can smell. They can be obnoxious. They're not saints. They're poor. But they're Jesus. We have to see Jesus in them. And that's hard. But that's the starting point. It is the key to understanding. What did Francis say when he was still Cardinal Bergoglio to the other cardinals? And it's the thing that got him elected. He said, we read in the scriptures, Jesus knocks at the door, and we assume he's knocking to get in. Maybe he's knocking to get out. Take the gospel into the streets.
Hi. I appreciate a lot of what you said here. But I'm not taking my mask off. I'm not breathing on this thing, but can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh,
yeah,
oh,
there,
okay, that's
perfect.
better. Okay. Now, I don't want to I don't want to offend,
No,
but
go right ahead.
in the beginning when you started talking and you used the example of Obama and, what's the other guy's name? No.
Dolan.
No. Obama and who was the president who got Clinton? Thank you very
Right.
much. Okay, I'm getting too old. When you talked about Clinton and Obama not giving jobs to the people, and that's what opened up the doors for and Trump, and that just shut me down completely because I live in the country, and I know that what set the stage for those people wasn't what any Democratic president was doing. I think that we can't give the Democrats a bad rap here at all because we're in big trouble. And what set the stage for him was the talk radio people, the Fox people. The Republicans are really smart about how they want to set us up. And we're in a lot of danger right now. And so I get really nervous when I hear anybody criticizing the Democratic rulers right now. Biden, I think, is the best president we've ever had. What he's up against, no other president ever had to be up against. And so I just want you to realize that the Democrats did not set the stage for what we ended up with the guy who I can't even say his name because I hate him so much. It was the talk radio people. It was the people who went for the demographics of the people you're talking about, who were unfortunate, didn't have jobs, were having their places closed down. But they don't understand about why they don't understand the Reagan economic plan versus help the poor. Don't tax the rich. All of these issues, they don't get it because they're hearing this other poison from these people who are so well trained to tell the lies and to make people think that Hillary Clinton eats babies. People believe that. And it's not because of the Democrats, it's because of these kinds of folks who think, well, who did. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I just have to say, Bill Clinton did sign NAFTA. And there were real economic consequences to NAFTA. Barack Obama came in after the economic recession and really did bail out Wall Street. And Elizabeth Warren really did say, can we start with the people who own the houses and are losing them, not with the banks who insured the mortgages? And Obama didn't listen to her. So I'm not going to give them a pass. And neoliberalism for 40 years under both parties was the economic. We all believe that the market worked. And
You don't have to give them a pass, okay? But don't think that they paved the way, because what paved the way for what's happening right now in our country is these people.
all societies are complex things. And all the, they obviously did not, the only thing that paved the way, but I think they bought into an economic model that they tweaked Reaganism at the margins, but they didn't confront it at the core. Whereas, again, from our Catholic tradition, go back to Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, where he calls what we know as laissez-faire economics a poisoned spring. 1931, he knew that laissez-faire economics was wrong. So, and they bought into that. Now, maybe that was what the politics is the art of the possible. And there's an argument to be made that they felt that. But the two things I can never forgive Bill Clinton for were NAFTA and reducing the capital gains tax. And we've never gotten that back. We've never gotten either one back, right? NAFTA's now gone away. But that cost a lot of jobs. And it did nothing for the countries of Latin America. It gave them a temporary bump until Malaysia said, we'll outbid Guatemala, and so the jobs went to Malaysia. But there was, you're not going to find a Bill Clinton speech criticizing free speech. I'll tell you, one of the great things about Washington is you get these inside jokes. And I voted for Obama. I voted for Clinton twice. Loved Obama. Loved Obama more than Clinton. Thought it was an amazing achievement that we had elected a black man. I remember going out onto the porch that day with a pot and a pan and saying, he won. It was such a great night. I don't know that I've ever felt more proud to be an American than that night in 2008. What I have since learned is in September before that election, President Bush called Obama and McCain into the White House with the congressional leaders to talk about the economic meltdown that we were going through. And Hank Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, went first. And he explained the crisis and that, the economy was tanking in a way no one at the table had ever experienced. And they weren't sure exactly what to do. And President Bush said, Senator McCain, is there anything you'd like to say? And he said, no, I'm just here to listen. He said, Senator Obama, is there anything you'd like to say? And soon-to-be President Obama got up and he gave this 15-minute tutorial, Economics 101, to this room. And when he finished, President Bush, who was a funny man, I disagreed with many of his policies, but he leaned to Nancy Pelosi and said, you're going to miss me when I'm gone. So, look, they were 100% better. And you're absolutely right. Talk radio. This is another essay I've got in my head. I think one of the keys to understanding the rise of Donald Trump is professional wrestling, is the suspension of belief, the good guy, bad guy. You go to not Syracuse, but to small Altoona. I don't know what the equivalent is in New York, but you go to those and they have an auditorium that seats 3,000 people, and they have professional wrestling things there, and it's filled, and that's been going on for 40 years. And I think Trump speaks to the people in that room in a way. But it's that suspension of belief, the Manichaeanism, good, evil, to the caricatures, the larger than life, the reality TV part of it, that absolutely paved the way. A lot of things paved the way. But on the economic stuff, I'm not going to give the Democrats a pass. Again, I'm an Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders Democrat. I actually am an El Grasso Democrat. Pro-labor, pro-life. She was great. Ella Grasso was the first woman governor in the country elected in her own right, and she was governor of Connecticut. And I got to meet her. I got pictures of me when I'm little with her, and she was great.
So we have time
she was
for
corrupt
one
as
more
hell.
question.
Yeah.
One more
Yeah.
question.
I want to thank you for taking the time and up and down the Thruway here to be here in Syracuse. I'm a pretty simple guy, and I think that you're partly right about Donald Trump, but Donald Trump represents old America. White male dominance, plain and simple. as they see the border, what they call the invasion, as the changing color of America, they don't have these people feel threatened. They feel that their history, their culture is going to die away. They don't have enough faith in the American dream to believe that it'll withstand this, that they've built a pretty good system here. So they go back. Donald Trump brings them back to their good old days. Donald Trump is their guy. It's pretty simple. It's not a difficult thing as a black man living in North America. He's their guy. He represents the Confederate South, or as I like to say, the Southern Democrats returned Republican during the Ronald Reagan. And we know what those are all about. And he knows how to exploit that, and knows how to exploit the misinformation that's taking place, and he's got the platform of Fox News. And he's their guy. He's not going away. They had opportunities, and he's not going to go away. As long as there's money being thrown his way, and he feels he's above the law, and he's getting away with it, he's their guy. He's not going anywhere. And the best thing for Biden, if he runs for president, because it's going to make it pretty clear for the American people that Joe Biden is pretty steady. And he can get the job done. He's not a flashy guy. And I think most Americans, and probably most, I won't say all of them, but most independents will probably feel the same way. Joe Biden will be lucky if Donald Trump runs against him. They'll probably win the election.
I'm not going to predict the 2024 election or even who the candidates are going to be. I will say this, it is something that we all have to reflect on, that between 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump improved his performance among both Latino and black voters. Among Latinos by a significant margin. And we have to say, how do we as Democrats, what did we miss? And so I'm a journalist. I try to find this stuff out. One of the things I found out from a guy at the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas is in the border area, they had flown in these young, Democratic operatives, organizers, fresh out of college, smart kids, the kind of kids you want to have on board, right? And they were knocking on doors. They spoke Spanish. And they'd go in and say, I'm here to speak on behalf of the Latinx community. And the people are, the what? The what? So now we have Pew did a study, and it turns out 4% of Latinos use the phrase Latinx. 4%. The other 96, half didn't know what it was, and the other half knew what it was and don't like it. They like the fact that their language is gendered. You can sing Spanish and Italian a hell of a lot easier than English, right? Because it ends in vowels, So he had followed these organizers, and as they moved on to the next house, they'd go into the first house. And he said they were registering 2 Republicans for every Democrat. Because they went in and they talked about a bunch of issues that these people didn't care about. The other thing we've learned about the Latino community, especially along the border, is immigration cuts a lot of different ways. There's not a lot of great jobs along the Texas-Mexico border, but some of those jobs are with the border control. And a lot of Latinos work with the border control. And so if you go in and you just demonize it, and again, if you don't listen first and find out who you're talking to and in Florida, the genius of the Republicans, Rick Scott, I think, is one of the scariest politicians in American life, right? The guy got away with like the largest fraud settlement on Medicare fraud in history at the time. It's been undone by others since. And he still got elected as governor twice. Part of it was he learned Spanish. And Democrats would show up 2 weeks before the election in the Latino community. He would go 6 months in advance, a year out. If they were opening an envelope, he would be there. And in the Latino community, you build relationships before you make a pitch if you want to be effective. It's like in the old Chicago politics. Somebody comes to a ward guy. What's the first thing he's going to ask you? Who sent you? Wants to know where the relationships are. So I don't disagree with anything you said about Trump, and I think that's all true, but I think it's more complicated. There's a great piece, I think it was in the Times of the Post today. It was a woman in Maine who ran first for the state, as a state rep, and won in a rural red district. She ran as a progressive Democrat, and it was written by her and her campaign manager. And then she ran for the state Senate and knocked off the highest ranking Republican in the state of Maine, running in a ruby red district as a blue Democrat. And she said, but what you do is you got to drive down those long driveways. One of the few things I miss in Washington, I had this great roommate, Andre, who was Jamaican, and he would come up with these observations. So we're visiting a friend on Cape Cod once, and we're driving down their driveway, and he said, you know, you got to be really rich or really poor to have a driveway this long. I was like, so smart. Anyway, but read this article. I'm blanking on her name, but I think it was in the Times yesterday or today. And it was like, you got to go in and you got to listen to their stories and find out what's on their mind, and you can win in rural America. Tim Ryan is trying to do this in Ohio. Tim Ryan is running as a young Joe Biden, and I hope it works, because Democrats used to be able to win Ohio, and now I'm not sure we still can. That primary is tomorrow, right? And the Republicans have got a raft of really lousy choices, and I hope they choose the lousiest, and that we can beat them. But that said, at the end of the day, again, this gets back to supporting democracy. We have to learn the art of persuasion again. And so I get suspicious of the large demographic narratives that say, well, this is about multiracial America. You still have to argue. You still have to give a presentation. The one reason I think why Republicans appeal to a Latino community, either the Latino, it was the mother or the grandfather, somebody came to America because they have this aspirational vision. There's a book called the Latinos Still Believe in the American Dream. It was John White, Catholic University politics professor, edited it. This is a lot of the Democratic language in recent years is that culture of grievance language. And Latinos just turned that off. They still think America's the shining city on the hill. And if you question it, you're questioning decisions their parents or grandparents made. That's part of their family lore. That's recent. They still go see the abuela who says every day, aren't you glad you're here in America? So we've got to recapture some of that. Of course, we have to be critical of there's plenty to criticize in America, but we've got to hear what they're looking for and learn to persuade and not count on demographics to take care of it. Demographics change, people grow, they stretch, the boundaries that we set for each other and for ourselves, please make them as porous as possible. There's always something to learn from the person you think has nothing to tell you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael. I'm sure he's willing to speak a little bit to individuals afterwards. Again, the bibliography is in the back, as well as the free will offering and the sign-up sheet if you want to be on the call to action listserv. Email.